G'day Year 11, this is another long one, so hang in there. 9.5 Slave Revolts. During the 2nd to 1st centuries BCE, there were a number of serious slave uprisings against the Romans. One, the First Servile War in Sicily from 135 to 133 BCE. Number two, the Second Servile War in Sicily, 104 to 100 BCE. There has to be something about Sicily here. Three, the Third Servile War in Italy, 73 to 71 BCE. It is the Third Servile War, led by the gladiator Spartacus, that is known in the popular culture of the 20th and 21st centuries through various films and TV series, literature, plays and novels, music, ballet, and even video games. The First and Second Servile Wars. The potential for violent resistance of slaves in the late 2nd century was both enormous and constant, with opportunity and resolve being all that was necessary for the potential to be realized. However, the first question that comes to mind is why these uprisings, only a generation apart, occurred in Sicily. The background. When Rome defeated Carthage in the First Punic Wars, 264 to 241, and annexed the Carthaginian-controlled island of Sicily as its first overseas province and its principal supplier of grain, it was the beginning of a transformation in the traditional Roman way of life. Two of the major changes were: 1. The growth of latifundia, owned by the upper classes who were the beneficiaries of the wealth that began to flow into Rome. 2. The lives of the upper classes became more luxurious, as did the number of slaves they employed. In Sicily, wealthy Romans took the land previously owned by the Carthaginians, and according to Diodorus Siculus, that's how you say that, Kaylee, after 60 years of good fortune in all respects, during which they shut up in all prosperity, they brought droves of slaves and began at once to apply marks and brands to their bodies. This is a more detailed quote. But they treated them with a heavy hand in their service and granted them the most meagre care, the bare minimum for food and clothing. As a result, most of them made their livelihoods by brigandage, and there was bloodshed everywhere, since the brigands were like scattered bands of soldiers, distressed by their hardships and frequently outraged and beaten beyond all reason, could not endure their treatment. Getting together an opportunity offered, they discussed the possibility of revolt until they at last put their plans into action. The Third Servile War of Spartacus. The three best sources on the War of Spartacus against the Romans are: 1. Plutarch, The Fall of the Roman Republic, Crassus, books 8 to 11. 2. Appian, The Civil Wars. 3. Florus, The Epitome of Rome. However, these are often contradictory. Who was Spartacus? There is little known about Spartacus until he led a number of Gauls and Thracians in an escape bid from the gladiatorial school run by Lentulus Baltius in Capua. However, there were a few brief words in the sources about his origin, and some vague reference that might explain how he ended up in a gladiator, sorry, in southern Italy. 1. Plutarch says that he was a Thracian from a nomadic tribe, but was later taken to Rome to be sold. 2. Appian describes him as a Thracian by birth who had once served as a soldier with the Romans but had since been a prisoner and sold as a gladiator. Sounds like the gladiator from the movie Gladiator. Uh, 3. Florus says that he was originally a Thracian mercenary who had become a Roman soldier, then a deserter and robber, and afterwards, from consideration of his strength, a gladiator. Historians believed that he may have come from the independent Mardi tribe of Thrace, who occupied the southwestern part of Thrace near the border of the Roman province of Macedonia, or present-day Bulgaria, which the Mardi frequently raided. In ancient times, Thracians were known as good warriors, or great warriors, I should say. Spartacus's link with the Mardi is also suggested by the fact that his wife, who was enslaved with him, was a Mardi prophetess. There is no doubt that at some time he was in the Roman army, but how this occurred and for how long he was part of it is unknown. Was he a mercenary volunteer, or was he somehow forced into the legions? That he had been trained as a Roman legionary is obvious from the accounts of his brief but significant revolt against Rome. Unlike most of the rebels he led, he was disciplined, skilled in maneuvers, and aware of the need to take up defensive positions. He knew when he held back, when he wasn't ready to face the Romans, and he was insistent on arming his men with proper Roman military weapons, regarding anything less as barbarous and dishonourable. When his officers were killed in battle, he celebrated their funerals in the traditional Roman in the tradition of Roman generals. Was he a deserter and robber, as Florus maintains, or was it some other twist of fate that landed him in the gladiatorial training school Ludus in Capua in southern Italy, among foreign slaves and criminals? How long he survived the brutal life of gladiator before he led the revolt is unknown. We know he was strong and was probably a heavily armed gladiator called a Gallus gladiator in Spartacus's time, after the so-called barbarian Gauls. The name of this category was later changed to Mamilius when the Gauls were integrated into Roman society, and it would have been a bit racist calling them that name. The city of Capua, on the fertile plain of Campania, had once equalled Rome in wealth and size, and by the time of Spartacus it was vital to Rome's economy as a centre of grain production, olives, and particularly wine. Many Romans had villas in the area due to the delightful climate. Alas, Capua had become known for its gladiatorial training schools in the 1st century BCE. Like many things in history, the view of the gladiator world has been made to appear somewhat remarkable glamorous, and even at times honourable. Although it is true that some gladiators did achieve temporary fame, it was a vicious and pitiless world that Spartacus was thrown into. Most were hardened criminals or slaves who had offended their masters in some way. The training was rigorous and discipline brutal. No one willingly entered the arena to be pitted against each other or torn to shreds by wild animals for the entertainment of the Romans. Their daily lives in the ludi were tough, being confined in close quarters until required to fight, and most owners, like Lentulus Batius, were cruel. Most gladiators lived with the thought of death every day. The gladiators among whom Spartacus lived appear to have been predominantly Gauls and Thracians. Was Plutarch correct in suggesting that perhaps Spartacus and others had done nothing to deserve such brutalization? He provides the only direct reference to Spartacus's character which might explain his motivation to escape. A man not only of high spirit and valiant, but in understanding also, and in gentleness superior to his condition, and more of a Grecian than the people of his country usually are. Escape and building up of a rebel force. Apparently, 200 gladiators had originally decided to make an escape, preferring to take their chances and fight for their freedom than spend their days entertaining bloodthirsty Roman citizens. Was Spartacus reacting to the humiliation of having been demoted from a position as Roman soldier and forced to live and defend himself like an animal? The escape plan was discovered, and only 70 to 78 who had anticipated the situation managed to escape, using for protection various kinds of cooking utensils which they took from the kitchens. As they made their way through the city, they came across several wagons filled with gladiators' equipment, with which they armed themselves. Others joined them as they made their way to Mount Vesuvius, the best defensible base in the area, and where they organized themselves and decided on matters of leadership. Probably under Spartacus's leadership, they created a military-like hierarchy. It seems that the rebel group was divided into two factions, one under Spartacus and another under two Gallic slaves named Crixus and Osymaus. I'm going to butcher that name. This body of the rebels, as it later turned out, was not a homogeneous group, and its individual members revealed different motivations once they had freed themselves and attracted tens of thousands of followers. Roman reaction. Plutarch provides details of the Romans' first attempt to deal with the rebels while they were still encamped on Mount Vesuvius. The praetor, Gaius Claudius Glaber, with a force of 3,000 men, marched south from Rome and took control of the only access route up to the mountain camp, a steep, narrow passage with precipices on all sides. Having successfully contained the rebels and prepared to wait while they starved or submitted, he had not banked on the ingenuity of the slave force. According to both Plutarch and Florus, they made rope ladders out of vine branches and escaped down the other side of the mountain, and in the surprise attack from the rear, they defeated the Roman force and took their camp. The rebel force then raided through Campania, Nola and Nuceria, and as far as Thurii and Metapontum. Flores said they caused widespread devastation, and as they were joined by new forces every day, they began forming themselves into a regular army. They made for themselves out of osiers and beasts' hides a rude kind of shield, and out of iron from which the slave houses forged swords and other weapons, and that nothing proper might be wanting to the complements of their army. They procured and the they procured cavalry by breaking in the herds of horses they came in their way, and conferred upon their leaders the ensigns and faces that they took from the praetors. According to Appian, the Romans, as they had done in Sicily, did not consider this a war as yet, but a raid, something like an outbreak of robbery, and sent forces picked in haste and at random. The first Roman forces led by praetors, not consuls. At the time, most of the Roman legions were in Spain under the command of Pompey, and in the east under Lucullus, two of Rome's most successful military leaders. After the failure of Glaber, the Romans sent out more praetorian forces under Verinius and Cosinius, and each time they faced Spartacus, they were defeated. As a result, even greater numbers fled to his army, which is said to have numbered 70,000. It was at this time that Spartacus marched his army towards the Alps, intending, when he had passed them, that every man should go to his home, some to Greece and some to Gaul. Had this been his real aim from the beginning, or, as suggested by Plutarch, that he came to realize that he would eventually be no match for the legions of Rome? But many of his rebel forces, overconfident with success and preferring to plunder and ravage the country, did not listen to Spartacus. It was then that the Senate finally grew alarmed by the nature of the insurrection and decided to send out two consular armies. Perhaps it was the memory of the great Carthaginian general, Hannibal, who moved about Italy for 15 years with one victory after another, that put fear into the government. The legions, led by Lentulus Clodiatus and Gallius Publicola, attempted to deal with the divided rebel force. Gellius overcame Crixus and 30,000 of his men, who in their overconfidence had struggled from Spartacus. They were cut to pieces and Crixus was killed. Lentulus and his army hindered Spartacus's march towards the Alps, and Gellius approached them from the rear. According to Appian, Spartacus dealt with each consular army in turn, and they retreated in confusion. As Spartacus moved towards the Alps, he was met at Mutina by Gaius Cassius, a praetorian governor of these parts, with 10,000 men. Spartacus destroyed Cassius's camp and killed large numbers of his men. Although his way across the Alps was now free of opposition, for some inexplicable reason, Spartacus decided to return south. Flores says that he had considered marching on Rome, but Appius said he changed his mind because he did not consider he was ready for that kind of fight, as his whole force was not suitably armed, for no city had joined him, but only slaves, deserters, and riffraff. Instead, he headed to the mountains around Thuri in southern Italy and took the city. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus. Finally, although Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome, he was ambitious to attain a military reputation. When he was elected to the praetorship in 73 BCE, He apparently offered to equip, train, and lead new troops at his own expense against Spartacus. The Senate appointed him to the command against the rebel army with 8 legions, 40,000 men. He hoped this would enhance his military prestige and help him gain popularity with the people of Rome, because he still wanted to become a consul. Initially, he had several problems. He had difficulty anticipating Spartacus's movements and inspiring his army. His subordinate, Mummius, disregarded his orders and openly attacked Spartacus, during which his forces were routed and his supply of arms abandoned. Crassus, furious at his subordinate's disobedience, employed the ancient punishment of decimation on 500 of Mummius's men, where 1 in 10 legionaries were killed by their fellows in full view of the army. Thereafter, discipline was restored, and Crassus had several successes against the rebel forces, pushing them further and further south. By 71, Spartacus was encamped in Rhegium near the Strait of Messina, from where he planned to take several thousand of his troops across to Sicily to rekindle the war of the slaves, which was but lately extinguished. However, the Cilician pirates Spartacus paid to ferry him and his men across the strait took their money and abandoned them. You can't trust pirates. Rhegium, being on a peninsula, gave Crassus the opportunity to wall the rebels in and cut them off from their provisions and way of escape. According to Plutarch, Crassus dug a ditch from one side of the isthmus, I hate that word, to the others, only 15 feet wide. Appian refers to it as a defence line composed of ditch, wall, and paling. Spartacus and his men retaliated by making frequent raids on the fortification with burning branches. So determined were they to break out that they waited for a dark, wintry night during a storm, and after filling in the ditch with earth, timber, and branches, Spartacus managed to lead a third of his forces to escape. Pompey had just returned from Rome, and Lucullus was approaching Italy. Crassus, fearing that they would be given credit for bringing the war to an end, needed to face Spartacus as soon as possible. The final battle. Spartacus had retired to the mountains of Petelia, but he could not stop his rebellious men from making a direct attack on Crassus' army, and seeing there was no way of avoiding a battle, he set up his army in array. The final battle is believed to have been fought near the mouth of the modern Selly River in southern Campania. When his horse was brought to him, he drew out his sword and killed him, saying, if he got the day, he should have a great many better horses of the enemies, and if he lost it, he should have no need of this. And so, making off directly towards Crassus himself, though through the midst of arms and wounds, he missed him, but slew 2 centurions that fell upon him together. At last, being deserted by those that were with him, he himself stood his ground, and surrounded by the enemy, bravely defended himself, was cut to pieces. Florus writes, as was fitting for a gladiator captain, they fought without sparing themselves. Spartacus himself, fighting with the utmost bravery in the front of the battle, fell as became their general. Appian also writes, the battle was long and bloody, as might have been expected, with many thousands of desperate men. Spartacus was wounded in the thigh with a spear and sank upon his knees, holding his shield in front of him and contending in his way against his assailants until he and his great mass of those with him were surrounded and slain. The remainder of his army was thrown into confusion and butchered in the crowds. So great was the slaughter that it was impossible to count them. The Roman loss was about 1,000. The body of Spartacus was not found. Modern estimates put the rebel dead as high as 36,000. 6,000 survivors on Crassus's orders were crucified along the Appian Way, the main route from Campania to Rome. He ordered that they were not to be taken down, but left hanging out to rot as a lesson to others who might consider rebelling against Rome. Pompey captured and killed 5,000 others who had escaped and claimed victory for bringing the slave war to an end. Well, that's to be expected. That's what Pompey was like. Thank you for listening, Year 11. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and enjoy the gameplay that you're going to be watching. And thanks again. Bye for now.